Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Cora McGuire-Cyrette, the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association, the oldest and largest Indigenous women's agency in Canada, which is based in Thunder Bay. McGuire-Cyrette, who is a member of Bingwi, Neashe, Anishinaabe in Northern Ontario, has been recognized for ONWA's work on human trafficking. In October of 2022, she was appointed to the Thunder Bay Police Services Board Governance Committee. The committee will have a critical role in the hiring of a new police chief for the embattled service. Cora, thanks so much for being with us this week.
I'm happy to be here to have this very important conversation here today.
It's been a pretty horrific week with the announcement of the murder of 4 Indigenous women in Winnipeg at the hands of an alleged serial killer. This with the backdrop of the National Day for Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Well, what went through your mind when you heard the news coming out of Winnipeg?
You know, normally when stuff like this happens, I tend to grieve as a collective, you know, Indigenous woman, right? Like when my fellow sisters are not well, you know, I'm not well. You know, this time, I don't know, that the pain was different. The pain was a lot of outrage and anger at what's going on, especially their response to the murders and to the deaths and to where their remains are and the lack of action and, you know, the systemic issue that continues to plague us. And I just really don't think that ignorance is no longer an excuse for what continues to happen to us as Indigenous women here in this country.
You're among the many who are saying these murders should be treated as a targeted hate crime against Indigenous women. Can you lay out your reasons why you feel that way?
Well, when you look at, you know, all 4 victims are currently Indigenous women that they know of. There's potential, like we don't know if there's any other potential victims because they're not searching. You know, but when you're looking at the fact that they are all Indigenous women, and here in Canada, there's a history of violence against Indigenous women where we're overrepresented in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we're overrepresented in human trafficking. You know, I was watching or reading a press release issued by the clan mothers out of Winnipeg just a little while ago, and in their press release, they talk about how 51 years ago, 19-year-old Helen Betty Osborne was killed. Mm-hmm. And, you know, 51 years ago and even longer, Indigenous women have been killed due to 2 factors, our race and our gender. Like that's what's so unique about these crimes and the lack of accountability for when it comes to our safety. And we as Indigenous women, we have a right to live and we have a right for safety. And when will we get the action and the investments that help support those rights?
The Ontario Native Women's Association is also urging police to look further into other potential victims, work with other police services. Can you talk about the need for this work?
You know, there's a need for them. Like, you know, we know serial killers, they tend not to be stopped until they're caught. And the depth and scope of his violence towards Indigenous women is unknown until they can investigate and look at it. And this issue here is really about that systemic discrimination and that systemic racism. And what we're seeing is the level of hatred towards Indigenous women in this country. And that's what we have to start to address and unpack because, you know, that's what's at a core fundamental level, what's happening here. And, you know, when the chief of police of Winnipeg is saying he doesn't know if they were targeted, I think every Canadian should be outraged right now when clearly, you know, there's a connection here between race and gender. And the more racialized you are in this country, the more likely you are to face violence. And this is where we have to start to look at where's the investments into prevention? Where's the investments into systemic change? And this is not the first time that Indigenous women have been discarded of in landfill sites, particularly in Winnipeg. So where was their investment and their strategy to prevent other women from being disposed of within those landfill sites? And we all know that if it wasn't for the fact of their race of being Indigenous, would their response or lack of response actually still apply if it was a non-Indigenous woman?
The mayor of Winnipeg, the premier of Manitoba yesterday have said we're going to pause work out at that landfill. But despite the urging of the families, leadership, others, police are so far defending their decision not to search a landfill where they believe the remains of at least 2 of these victims are. What do you make of that decision?
You know, this is what systemic discrimination and racism looks like, and the lack of accountability towards the violence that we receive. And so this is how violence is normalized in community. You know, it starts, you know, where's the systemic change to happen here? Where's, you know, the strategies around Indigenous women's safety within each and every community here in Canada? You know, we know that, you know, this is not the first serial killer, and it's not going to be the last until we do something, until we act upon it, and we actually invest in Indigenous women's safety all across this country.
It's been a particularly deadly year in Winnipeg and Thunder Bay, both setting grim records for homicides, although Thunder Bay's is, I would say, very much gang-related in some ways. 11 Indigenous women in Winnipeg have so far been murdered in 2022. What do you think is behind these numbers?
You know, during the pandemic, violence against Indigenous women continued to increase. You know, prior to the pandemic, we were facing a crisis, and we know that whenever you're facing a crisis, it's, you know, compounding crises. And the lack of response and lack of investment into Indigenous women's safety is really at a fundamental level that still hasn't continued to happen here yet. And that's like, you know, when we're looking at the violence, it's going to continue to increase because there is limited to no safe spaces for Indigenous women to go to safely exit, whether it be human trafficking or it be domestic violence, or, you know, the National Inquiry spoke about the lack of safe, affordable housing for Indigenous women to safely live with them and their children. So the lack of housing responses. And so, you know, when you're looking at violence against Indigenous women, a lot of people, you know, may think that it's like one bad person, looking at an individual level, but it actually isn't. It's a systemic failure as a society and as a community. And so that's what we have to unpack, is all of those systemic issues, you know, one by one. It's all interconnected.
I hate to put numbers on it, but I think numbers are important. And Statistics Canada recently released the numbers for 2021, where they found 45 Indigenous women were victims of police-reported homicide, an additional, that was 3 more than the previous year. Did you ever think 3 years out from the end of the National Inquiry that this would be continuing?
You know, we had hoped, right? Like, you know, we had called, we stood with the woman, grassroots woman who started this movement and who demanded an inquiry. You know, it wasn't the inquiry that we wanted, but it was the inquiry we received. And so now it's all about looking at how do we honor Indigenous women who are no longer here, but really how do we honor their story, because those women were also mothers, and their stories and the stories of survivors were very clear. You know, the reason why survivors spoke out about this violence is because they wanted it to stop. They wanted to prevent further harm to come to other Indigenous women, to come to their daughters, and they wanted the story to change for their grandchildren's grandchildren. They're very clear about that. And that's what we're not seeing. We're not seeing investments on the ground in community that actually address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You know, you could actually have, you know, unidentified remains in one province and have a missing person in another province. And the lack of data sharing between those 2 provinces, it could be the same woman. And so a family literally could potentially have closure to knowing where their loved one is. But because of, you know, violence doesn't know jurisdictional bounds. It doesn't work that way. So we have to begin to start working together.
Cora, we just have to step aside for a quick break, but then we're going to continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Cora McGuire-Cyrette, the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association. Stay Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Cora McGuire-Cyrette, the Executive Director of the Native Women's Association of Ontario. Now in its 51st year, it is the oldest and largest Indigenous women's agency in Canada. And Cora, before the break, we were discussing the ongoing cases of MMIWG2S, and as we mentioned, we're 3 years out from the release of the final report. How do you think the implementation of the calls to justice are going?
Too slow. You know, the response needs to be expedited based on addressing crises like we're seeing right now out of Winnipeg. You know, when I'm looking at, you know, some of the calls, I always kind of place it within you know, my own family's story of, you know, our loved one, Jamie McGuire. She's no longer here. You know, she's an unresolved case out of Winnipeg. And I always look at kind of the calls and responses to, like, would those investments have, you know, saved her life? Like, you know, so when you're looking at some of the investments around, you know, culture, language, or, like, you know, special days, though none of those are all important things that we need to do. But at the end of the day, like, where's the investment into safety, and where's the investment into educating, you know, the public that Indigenous women are, you know, to be honored and to be respected, and, you know, to stop dehumanizing us as Indigenous women, because that's at a core fundamental level. We need accountability. And, you know, listening to, like, the clan mothers out of Winnipeg, and they're talking about how they're developing models of care to support Indigenous women. And, you know, Indigenous women's agencies all across Canada continue to pick up their responsibilities off of, you know, shoestring budgets, if they have any budget at all. And they're trying to create these safe spaces for Indigenous women. Like, you know, there's a lack of funding for Indigenous women shelters all across Canada. There's a lack of safe spaces for Indigenous women to go and access, where they can be safe from gangs, to be safe from, you know, human trafficking, to be safe from, just to be safe at the end of the day. Where's the investments into infrastructure for safe spaces for Indigenous women to come together to heal from the violence they faced, if they're lucky enough to be a survivor? When are we going to start to change the story and create a new legacy for our grandchildren?
Bringing it closer to home for you, a report that was leaked to APTN earlier this year confirmed that there are at least 25 unsolved cases of MMIWG with the Thunder Bay Police. Did that number come as a surprise for you?
No, because, you know, when we start to see the data and the lack of data all across Canada, we really don't know what the true number of MMIWG is in Canada. We don't know the stories, the data that connects to real policy change. And some of the data that's missing, it's around, like, what is the true number in all jurisdictions all across Canada, at local municipal police services to OPP to RCMP, from every police force all across Canada. What is that true number? On top of that, what is their story? Like, you know, who killed them? How did they die? All of those components that are hard conversations to talk about. But that data tells us, you know, key factors on how to prevent future deaths. You know, here in Ontario, there's the coroner's review, which looked at some of the data happening here across the province. And one key recommendation that came from there is that a lot of the homicides are related to domestic homicides. Mm-hmm. And what's so important about that data is the fact that those homicides are preventable deaths by having access to shelters, by having access to safety plans, by having access to a safe space to go. So when we know how to prevent these deaths, why are we not preventing them?
Some of those 25 cases in Thunder Bay go back more than 20 years. Do you believe police then or now even have taken those cases seriously?
It's hard to say. I doubt historically. I think the data definitely shows that, you know, when we're looking at systemic change, within a system, the system needs to really change the way that they look at Indigenous women, which means, everything from missing persons cases all the way through to investigating all forms of death, right? And looking at, there's so many recommendations here for Thunder Bay, we just have to start acting upon them. And that's why I had chosen to volunteer on the Thunder Bay Police Services governance committee, is to come up with a strategy to implement those recommendations. So I can say, I'm definitely dedicated to doing what I can to help create a strategy to implement those changes so that the city and the police services and the system and society here locally does take it very seriously going forward. So, that's that's why I had decided to volunteer for the position.
I'm hoping to talk about that in a bit too, but concerns within the Indigenous community with the Thunder Bay Police goes back decades. In more recent years, independent reports have found the service, the board were systemically racist. Do you feel that things are beginning to improve?
I think, because the conversation is happening and there's media on it, I do think that it's improving because, when you're looking at an issue like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, nobody knew what that was. Nobody believed that it was happening. And so now here we're able to actually openly talk about it. But I think the issues we're facing here locally also apply to all police forces all across Canada. We have to really look at how are we going to make change systemically within all the police forces here in Canada. Like when you're looking at what's happening out of Winnipeg, right? When you're looking at, that's why when we look at those recommendations from the OIRPD and Senator Murray Sinclair's report, those recommendations apply to every police force, from coast to coast to coast, in my opinion, because they are good practices around looking at, to including building relationships with the Indigenous community, to have best practices around policy and investigations, to look at providing culturally appropriate, trauma-informed education and support for those working with vulnerable populations, especially when you're working with the Indigenous community. So all those recommendations, they started here, but as we're seeing what's happening in Winnipeg, systemic racism and discrimination, is built within systems. And so we have to start to unpack these systems one policy at a time.
Cora, we're going to talk more about hopefully your role with the governance committee there, but we just have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Cora McGuire-Cyrette. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Cora McGuire-Cyrette, the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association. Cora, we mentioned you're going to be on this Thunder Bay Police Services Board Governance Committee. Well, one of the things the committee will have a role in is selecting a new Chief of Police. What do you think that the city needs?
I think the city needs change, systemic change, obviously. But when you're looking at, hiring, we really are looking for a leader, somebody who's, the issues we're facing here, they need to be able to come in with their eyes wide open to the issues we're facing here locally. And they need to be able to have experience working, with Indigenous people. Obviously, it's critical. And the issues we're facing locally here on the ground, we're facing a mental health and addictions crisis, just like I'm sure many other communities all across Canada. We have a very large issue here on the ground around Indigenous safety related to, the level of human trafficking that we're seeing here on the ground. Clearly, we have, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we have to look at how are we going to work together with community, because, the police is, one part. And so, the leadership and the system as a whole needs to look at how they're going to work with community.
As you know, there are calls for the Chief of Police here to resign over what's been happening with this search or lack thereof. There were calls for the Chief of Police in Thunder Bay to resign as well before she was suspended and under investigation. Is a new chief of police in Thunder Bay, though, is that going to solve the problems that the police service there has?
I think no. I don't think one person, that expectation is realistic, because it's a systemic issue. You have to look at the system as a whole. So you've got the governance at a governance level. There's responsibilities there. At a leadership level, there's responsibilities there, and then within the services, there's responsibilities there. And we have to start to do things differently if we really want to make this work, and for the communities to be safe at the end of the day. So, really looking at what we can all do in addressing these issues. And, that's the difficult part of when you're looking at making systemic change, especially something that's as widespread that we interact with so frequently, such as like a policing services all across Canada.
Cora, we mentioned ONWA has been around for 51 years now. How has ONWA been able to support Indigenous women and their families over that time?
We've, working alongside Indigenous women over the years, they're the knowledge holders, they're the experts, and they know what needs to happen. And, we get the privilege and honor of being able to amplify their voices from the community up. And, so some of the work that we've been able to do with the women, we helped support, for instance, last year, 315 Indigenous girls, children, and women to safely exit from human trafficking all across Canada. In addition to that, we also helped provide 95,000 direct one-on-one services to Indigenous women and her families, all the way through to providing vaccines. We provided 15,000 vaccines to urban Indigenous people here locally in Thunder Bay. And, so the work we do, it's walking that healing journey with Indigenous women, and we're taking up our responsibility. What we need is for everybody else to take up theirs and to look at how we unpack racism and how do we continue to work with Indigenous women for their safety and security.
Important work indeed. Cora, our government's funding and supporting Indigenous women's organizations like ONWA to the point where they can ensure that Indigenous women are not the most vulnerable group of women in society.
We do have some investments, but at the end of the day, it's not enough. Like when you're looking at all of these issues that we're facing, and the investments need to connect with what the need truly is on the ground, because, that's what needs to happen. And we need investments from all levels of government all across Canada, from municipality to the province, all the way through to the national level.
Cora, we're out of time, but certainly appreciate you taking some of your time to have this very important conversation with us here this week.
Miigwech, thank you for having me.
And you can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us here on Face to Face. Have a great night, and we'll see you back here